Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a thrill to be here with you. I view it as, along with my colleagues, an honor and a privilege to be part of this new academy and to try to help build our understanding of the digital revolution that many of us believe we're in the early stages of. What I'd like to do this morning is to try to frame the issue as I've wrestled with it for the last couple of years in terms of sort of benefits and challenges. And I guess the starting point is that you really can't turn around these days without discovering digital technology affecting something. It's sort of everywhere. It's in the distribution of income, it's in growth patterns, it's in global supply chains, it's in health and medical care and so on. And so it's very difficult to try to sort of get a handle on this, and so that's what I'm going to try to do today. First, let me do a brief amount of history. This is all happening very fast. The internet became a property of the public and the World Wide Web only 25 years ago. It existed before that, but it wasn't really accessible. The mobile internet is even younger. It's about 15 years old. And for most of the early history, the internet was an open, largely unregulated, except for technical specifications and protocols, entity. I think if you go back 15 years and listen to people talk, they would think digital technology is a bunch of sort of neat, relatively new services, sectors, and so on. If you fast forward to today, most people would say the digital technologies are becoming part of the fundamental foundations on which all our economies are built. And the other comparison I wanted to sort of start out with is that, at least in the developed countries, the mood about sort of digital technology, at least the way people interact with it, was essentially all good up until about 3 or 4 years ago, and now it's all bad. And I personally don't think either of these things can be right. So what I'm sort of after today is at least my, humble attempts to get a balanced view of the sort of considerable benefits that may come from this and the considerable challenges that we have to confront while we deal with it. Pretty much everything has changed. That open internet is in the process of being regulated. The regulations are coming at the national level and so on. If you pick up, journals, newspapers and so on, and start reading, most of what you read now will be about problems of the type that Chen Long just mentioned. Data privacy, internet content, foreign interference, fake news, false news, etc. The list is sort of endless. And so I think what we've lost track of, at least in that part of the world, is where the benefits lie. So that's what I want to focus on today. So the main message I want to get across is that because of the enormous spread of the impact of digital technologies, we have to start out by asking, what are the dimensions of well-being or welfare or progress? Because at least as far as I can tell, and this is very difficult to prove because we're in the midst of something that's going to take its own course over the next few years, even decades, is that the digital technologies are affecting virtually all the dimensions of welfare. Sometimes positively, frequently positively, sometimes negatively. We economists increasingly say exactly that we need multidimensional measures, but then we tend to fall back on things like growth, productivity, national income statistics. So the second thing I want to say, and this is a guess, just a guess, is that I believe there will be an impact of digital technologies on traditional measures, growth and productivity. I suspect they will come with a fairly long, unexpectedly long lag. But I also believe, and forgive me if I can't prove this to you this morning, that when historians look back, they'll discover that the lion's share of the really big impacts on human welfare are going to come in dimensions other than material well-being, which is what growth, incomes, GDP per capita, and the like tend to measure. So when you look out at the world, what you see, and I think the reason the mood has turned sour, is we start with this tendency to look at, well, how are we doing by the conventional measures? So on the one hand, we've caught people talking about a digital revolution. We've got virtually every CEO in the world talking about what their plan for digitizing their business is, or worrying about the fact that they don't have a plan and hiring high-priced consultants to help them get it done, on the one hand. And on the other, we look at the macroeconomic statistics, and growth is slowing globally. There's a notable slowdown in productivity, and people say, well, where are the benefits? I think there's three kind of strands of answers to that question. So one of them, I think, can't be dismissed. It's the one associated with Professor Robert Gordon, which is essentially to reject the premise. This is not a revolution. Relative to things like electricity that have happened in the past, and we shouldn't be worried about this. It's just not that big a deal. Now, I don't think that's the majority view, but once again, it's a forecast that you can't reject, in advance. I think it's sort of inconsistent with a fairly massive amount of anecdotal evidence that we have. The second hypothesis, which is the one I think that makes the most sense at this stage, is the lag hypothesis. So Bob Solow and Steve Roach and others famously said in the 1980s, we can see computers everywhere except in the productivity data. Then, ironically, we had a productivity spurt, at least in the United States, in the 1990s. Then it fell off again after the internet bubble, and we have this pattern of declining productivity. But when you really look at the relationship between the talk and the implementation, and there have been fairly serious studies of this, there's a huge gap. And it's not a surprising gap. The technologies like this, to have real impact that shows up in the macroeconomic sense, in the data, take literally decades to implement. They involve changes in behavior, changes in organizational structure, all kinds of things that cause lags. So you've heard about the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is starting to happen, but it's mostly talk. There's studies by McKinsey, Global Institute, and others that suggest, that are very detailed, that go through businesses and sectors in multiple dimensions of digital adoption. And if you look at the graphs, basically you see that there's one or two sectors, the tech sector itself and probably finance, that are pretty advanced. And then you start seeing yellow and red all over the graph. And you realize that there's relatively little that's been accomplished, even with respect to the technologies that we know can be implemented. The third way of tackling this has to do with measurement. And I think this is a really difficult issue. So I think you all know that national income statistics everywhere are A, useful, and B, they're based largely on market transactions. So anything that doesn't go through a market, like work at home, doesn't appear in the national income statistics. Anything that has a zero price will automatically not show up. So all the services that are a joint product, if you like, with the data that the advertising folks use are free. They're free for a good reason. The marginal cost of delivering them is zero. There's no inefficiency there, right? And presumably, and there are studies of this by Eric Brynjolfsson and others, that suggest the consumer surpluses are fairly big, but the consumer surpluses were never supposed to be part of the national statistics. And the other thing is that it has to do with the cost characteristics of these technologies. The digital technologies tend, because of the characteristics of data and information and software and so on, to have moderate to high fixed costs and very low variable costs in use, which is why the prices are very low. And if even big, expensive general purpose technologies like image recognition get used over a vast territory, the average costs become very low. So what we're seeing is a set of technologies that are arriving in our society with very low, with services associated with them that are very low or zero priced. We're seeing huge upgrades in the power and so on of the devices that we're carrying around with this. Everybody in this room has a mid-1980s supercomputer in their pocket, right? They cost about the same, probably less, than what a desktop computer costs, which isn't connected to the internet. None of that appears in the national statistics. And as a result, we don't know what the value of that is. Now, there have been attempts to adjust for this. There are price indices that have been constructed that are roughly based on Moore's law, that are meant to capture the declining cost of sort of things of comparable power. If you use those price indices on the data, instead of an ordinary price index, a general price index, what you see is sort of skyrocketing output measured in, ostensible market terms. So some people think we should adjust the data and do that. That's probably a bad idea. The national income is pretty useful stuff. National GDP is related to income. We care about incomes because that's what people use to purchase things. We use debt ratios all the time in finance and macroeconomic things. We don't want to screw that measure up. So the conclusion I've come to is that the people like Joe Stiglitz, like many, many people who have thought about this, are right. We need multidimensional measurement systems. And we don't want to start fooling around and trying to adjust the GDP measures. Now I'd like to put a little color on this and shift away from the national income. But let me summarize first. I think most of the benefits are going to have difficulty showing up in national income for the reasons I just mentioned. And second, that isn't the lion's share of the benefits, but we'll find out somewhere down the road. Second, to the extent that the digital economy benefits do show up in material well-being, which is a kind of summary term for the conventional measures, I think it will happen with a lag for reasons that are reasonably well understood in economics. Now I'll go over to the other side. There's no way to sort of capture this entirely now because we have no databases for doing it. But I'd like to give you, or try to give you, the flavor of this and to say why these things are important. What are these other dimensions? Well, they're based on things that people care about. So people care about health, right? They care about the opportunity set for their children. They care about material well-being, so that belongs on the list. They care about security. And then they have social concerns. They care about fairness and distributional issues and so on, all of which are going to appear in various multidimensional measures of economic and social progress. So let me take the healthcare one. 2 or 3 years ago, a couple of young people at Stanford got the hang of the image recognition technology that's developed in the last 5 to 7 years. By the way, is one of the most powerful general purpose technologies I've seen in my lifetime. So they decided that you could use this technology for detecting skin cancer. They went to the dermatologist, a top flight group at Stanford Medical School, and they said, "Do you want to give this a try?" And the dermatologist said, sure, let's do it. This is, by the way, an example that's replicated in other areas in health many times. So they worked very hard and assembled, I think most of you know how AI works, but you have to have a training data set, and they didn't have one readily available, so they assembled several tens of thousands of images of skin cancers of the type that dermatologists look at. That's hard work. And then they had a bit of a problem, which is they needed the image recognition engine, which is an enormously expensive thing to build, so Google gave them theirs for this purpose. And they tried it, and it worked, okay? It worked in the sense that the dermatologist said that's pretty good. Now, there's a lot of follow-on work about type 1 and type 2 errors, and false positives and false negatives, and where to set the bar in terms of probability, because artificial intelligence algorithms are really prediction machines in specific contexts. There's a very good book, by the way, called Prediction Machines, that's written by 3 professors at the University of Toronto. I highly recommend it. It's sort of an economist layman's guide to artificial intelligence. Now, how do we interpret this? So the machines didn't, blow the dermatologist out of the water. So here's the way I think about it. I live in a reasonably advanced city called Milan in northern Italy. Most of you probably live in cities. So ask yourself the question, what's the relevance of this, other than it's sort of interesting that a machine can do somewhat reasonably well relative to trained dermatologists? The answer is probably very little. Are you going to stop going to a dermatologist? No, right? You have one handy. The dermatologist has to do things the machine can't do, like excise the thing, get it biopsied, treat it if it's actually some form of skin cancer, and so on. But then you realize that 80% of the world's population is nowhere near a dermatologist, okay? And all of those people, or many of them, have a phone in their pocket, and that phone has a camera, right? So the impact of this is not beating dermatologists, although that may be a kind of cute way to think about it. The impact is inclusion. There's a very large number of people who probably are at high risk because it's too costly to travel 100 miles for primary care checkups, right? The second observation about this is this going to cost anything significant? Is it going to show up anywhere in the statistics? No. This capability, once it's fully developed, is replicable and then distributable around the world essentially at zero cost. It's all software, right? There's a similar example in diabetes and an eye problem in India. Traditional treatment of that is to go to an ophthalmologist. If you can't catch it early, you don't go blind. Problem is there's 11 ophthalmologists per 1 million Indians, right? Inclusion, again, if you see what I mean. Now, I'm going to run out of time, so I can't go on about this. But I think, so let me sort of wind it up. There's, I think, a really good study done. It's the first study of the Luohan Academy on inclusive growth patterns. It's about to be published. What that documents using the Alibaba and Ant Financial Alipay data is startlingly patterns of inclusiveness in the growth in e-commerce, the growth associated with the proliferation of e-commerce and mobile payments in China. I think it's really interesting, and it also supports this proposition that the digital economy is going to have, it's going to have traditional growth effects. I don't have any doubt, even though they're hard to measure, that the digital economy in China, which is developed faster than anywhere else in the world, especially in the payments area, is going to have a measurable effect on growth in China, in part because it's accelerating the process of people who are out of the modern economy by bringing them in. But its really important effect is the inclusion one. Now, if I had a lot more time, and I'd probably bore you to death, I would give you lots more examples, but I think the point is made that we need, if we want to have a balanced assessment of the challenges and the benefits, we've got some hard work to do in a multidimensional framework to try to bring into focus the benefit side. If we don't do that, and I think it's a research agenda, if we don't do that, then we're going to end up in the position, perfect, that we start focusing on the negative side and then start making mistakes, regulatory mistakes, underfunding of basic research mistakes, and on all kinds of things that will cost us down the road. Thanks very much.